You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Late last year, an atmospheric river caused devastating flooding across western Washington. Today, some estimate the region-wide damages may be over $1 billion. For parts of Whatcom County, it was the second major flood in less than 5 years, and people there are looking for solutions. New reporting from the New York Times highlights how communities around the Nooksack River are debating how to mitigate damage from future flooding. Dredge the river of sediment now, or attempt a more ambitious plan to return the river to its natural state? In many ways, the conversation pits farmers and homeowners' concerns against environmental advocacy and tribal rights. Bernard Mocum reported on this story for the New York Times, and he's here with me now. Bernard, hi. Welcome to the show, and thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure most of Western Washington and most Washingtonians overall remember this atmospheric river that was just causing flooding all over our region in December. You focused on the area of Northwest Washington, Whatcom County, so communities like Sumas that are right on the border there with Canada. Can you just remind us how bad the flooding was in December from the people that you spoke to and the reporting that you did?
For many residents in Sumas, in an area that they refer to as the flow split, because by the Everson Bridge, the floodwaters, they leave the Nooksack River channel and they flow north and they really inundate the cities of Everson, Nooksack, and Sumas. And so that region known as the flow split, in some places, a third of homeowners have had water in their homes. In a place like Sumas, 3 out of 5 residents have reported damages. And so for those locals, they're feeling very exposed to this increasing flood risk. And they were really hankering to get something done to bring relief so they can stay in the region.
And can you remind us, 2021 was just a few years ago, and this area also saw this massive flooding, incredibly damaging flooding. What happened in the years since 2021 up until those 2025 floods when it comes to, mitigation, repair, getting money into homeowners' hands? Like, how did the relief work go after 2021?
I would say, from my perspective and my entry point into the story, one of the legacies of the 2021 flood is this volunteer process known as floodplain integrated planning, or FLIP, and that is a kind of body that's set up by the county to bring all the stakeholders to the table. And you have many different groups in Whatcom County who are all participating in a discussion on how to mitigate flooding. And that was sort of my entry point into the discussion. As it relates to what was done to bring relief, I mean, that story is also mixed. I mean, the county applied for federal assistance. One of their applications was approved more quickly than the other. And so when I was in Whatcom in January, I spoke to residents who were still waiting for federal aid to have their home lifted.
Still waiting after 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, after 4 or so years, essentially, yeah. And they were frustrated and bitter about it.
So you reported on what some residents want to see happen when it comes to mitigating the damage of future floods. And Bernard, that involves dredging. That there's a petition to dredge the river that has almost 4,000 signatures, and this is a pretty small community, so that is a significant portion of residents. So what do the people who support dredging want to see, and why, Bernard?
I think the dredging discussion, or the gravel removal discussion, there's many different parts to it. A lot of residents, they're referring to a period of gravel harvesting that existed in the county until the 1990s. And they're using that as an explanation for the recent flooding. Effectively, the logic is the gravel harvesting created a buffer, and now that the protection that we had built up is running out, and so we should do something about it. Because flooding is caused by increased peak flows, or higher peak flows, more water volume, and shrinking channel capacity. And so for those who support dredging, it can be quite an intuitive proposal because you're saying, oh, we can just remove gravel, create more channel capacity, and then we would have a buffer from flooding. There's another, I think, perspective about dredging that it tends to how the landscape has changed over generations due to the infrastructure, such as bridges and levees. And bridges and levees, they disrupt the river's ability to transport sediment downstream. And essentially, some say by having infrastructure here, we've also committed to having some sediment management plan. Um, and so those are the kind of two ideas behind dredging.
Because if you've already changed the natural flow of the river, you've changed its ability to flush out that sediment. And so the argument goes that means you must do sediment management. You must do some type of dredging.
Yeah, there's some in the county that think so.
Yeah. Okay, obviously not everybody agrees with this plan. And, some of the major opponents of the idea of dredging are the Lummi Nation. And you spoke with Chairman Anthony Hilaire. What did he tell you about the tribe's stance and why they don't want to see an increase in dredging on the river?
Well, I spoke to the Lummi Nation. Also, I spoke to the Nooksack Indian tribe, and I would say that the idea of dredging in the long term is something that they are concerned about for, I think, the risk to salmon habitat and wildlife habitat. And then there was another idea that um, through dredging, you could unearth sacred cultural artifacts in the ground. And if they end up in the wrong hands, it could sort of defile their own history. And they were just, I think, supportive of the idea of kind of allowing the river to return to its natural processes. And but the tribes did seem more interested in short-term dredging, like dredging to a means to an end or gravel removal to a means to an end, if it is ultimately going to help recover salmon and improve wildlife habitat.
Water rights and fishing rights underlie, some of the most important and pivotal court cases in, tribal history and Washington state history, to be honest. Like the ability of tribes to access their habitual fishing areas has led to major settlements with the state over, the access of fish and the ways that we have to improve culverts all across our state in terms of underneath, roadways and freeways. The access of the tribes to manage these waterways is another huge part of, this legal picture and what's going to happen with the Nooksack River. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with the water rights lawsuit that, is going to have an impact on what happens with the Nooksack?
It was something I was thinking about a lot when I was in Whatcom. So the county is going through a water rights adjudication, which is essentially a process that establishes who has a legal water right and how much access do they have. And then there is another component to it. It lists all people with legal water rights in seniority. And the tribes, our Chairman Hilaire, when I spoke to him, he quoted a central principle of Washington water rights law, which is first in time, first in right. And he said to me, and we've been here since time immemorial. And I think the seniority component to water rights really factors in to one of the conundrums the region is facing, which is during the winter, they have more water than they know how to handle. But during the summer, water is essentially a scarce resource. And there's kind of competition between different groups over who has access to it. And adjudication is a process through which to establish some kind of legal boundaries to those questions of competition and access.
You mentioned that the tribes are okay with the short-term dredging in service to a bigger plan, basically. And that bigger plan has to do with the idea of restoring the Nooksack River more to its historic boundaries, like the natural state of the river. That would involve a lot of things. That would involve the purchase of land along the river. It would involve removing a lot of those levees that artificially changed the path and the way that the river flows. But ultimately, the goal is what? Like, what does that plan look like, Bernard? And how likely is that plan of moving forward at this point?
So the plan is referred to as widening the funnel. And it's essentially you set the levees back. In the case of the Everson Bridge, in the Twin View levee, so this is the flow split area I had mentioned previously. What you would do is you would set the levees back and you would give the river more room to restore some of its natural processes to kind of transport sediment on its own. And this would help reduce flooding and it would also improve habitat. But it is, I would say, beset by a cascading set of challenges. And one of the interesting sort of realities about river management is that, yes, in Whatcom, it's an exercise in consensus building, but it also attends to reality that if you alter something in one part of the river, you have to account for the effects in another part of the river. And so the county is kind of grappling with that reality. And this struggle manifests in many different ways. You have communities in Sumas who want quick relief, but the county is constantly figuring out what the impacts of their decisions will be, which is another study process.
Because if you have a lot more water flowing down the river, it will go to other communities. And you have to see what's going to happen there before you go forward with a plan to widen the channel, right?
100%. I mean, essentially, you can push the levees back and widen the funnel also includes some short-term dredging. At least that's the county's sort of ambition. And if you remove gravel by the Everson Bridge, they will send more water downstream. And if you're sending more water downstream, you have to study the effects and then mitigate them. And so that is kind of the balancing act the county is trying to strike.
So you have a lot of different people with overlapping interests here. I mean, you obviously have residents of these communities, Everson, Sumas, Nooksack, who are seeing repeated flooding, and we're seeing worsening flooding. They're not getting the help that they need fast enough, at least from the federal government or from other sources. They want to see a quicker fix, basically dredge this river, the Nooksack River, remove the sediment, which they say needs to be done anyway because it's been artificially contained and therefore has more sediment than it should per square meter or whatever. Then you have the tribes who are saying, listen, salmon habitat is paramount. And if we're going to do anything, we should be restoring the river to its natural banks. And that will take, yes, some dredging, but it'll also take a lot of studying, a lot of work, down the line. So it's going to be a longer term process. I mean, who is going to be the decider here, Bernard? Like, how does this actually get adjudicated?
I mean, one of the realities, like I said, is in Whatcom County, river management is an exercise in consensus building, and the volunteer process I mentioned, FLIP, is sort of based on striking or achieving a unanimous support. And so it seems like the county has found a solution in the widen the funnel concept that will reduce flood hazard risk and also improve wildlife habitat. But in order to realize this, they will have to do it kind of piecemeal. And so the first step is looking at how to remove gravel by the Everson Bridge. The second step would be they would have to, before they could push the levees back, they would have to push a pipeline back. And so that will be a period of study. And then, one of the sensitive elements of this is that it requires land acquisition. So private landowners will have to give up their land and to be, paid fairly, but nonetheless, they'll have to give up their land. And some of the farmers I spoke to were not interested in that. And so that will be one of the challenges the county is facing.
So what's the timeline for all this, Bernard?
So the county is currently studying the effects of sending more water downstream to the communities of Linden, Ferndale, and the Lummi Reservation. And once they're able to do that, they will have to mitigate for those effects. And so this is a period of study that could take a year, more than a year. And so when I was speaking to county officials, they were very cautious of providing a timeline because this work that they're doing does require a lot of time, and part of it that's by design to ensure that the interests of, for example, the tribal community are protected and to ensure that whatever they do doesn't have any adverse effects to the river and to the people who live beside it.
Bernard Whatcom is a news assistant for the New York Times. Bernard, we spoke a little before we started the interview, and you said that, you had been doing follow-up reporting on the damage from the flooding, and that's how this story of the future flood mitigation came to you. I mean, Bernard, the idea of whether to dredge or not, the idea of whether to restore the river to its natural state, these get to really fundamental questions about how we relate to the natural world, right? I mean, do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, it's when you speak to river managers in Whatcom County, some of them bring up the river's history itself. Supposedly, it followed the route that it follows when it overflows until several hundred years ago, when its course shifted and it now heads towards the Puget Sound. And so, one of the takeaways there is that society has kind of developed blind to the dangers of the natural world. And then one of the conversations the county is having about that reality is, do you defer to nature? And so in the case of widening the funnel, do you give the river more room? Or do you have nature defer to you? And so that's the case of, constructing bank armoring and levees around the river to control the river. But in this case, it shows that that's kind of helped create the problem that the county is dealing with. And it's one of these kind of perpetual struggles that all societies are facing.
Thank you. Bernard Whatcom with the New York Times, and he reported on the questions of flood management, to dredge or not to dredge, to widen the river or not to widen the river on the Nooksack in Whatcom County. Thank you very much, Bernard.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.